The arrival. The showroom gleamed like a palace, every surface reflecting the brilliance of carefully positioned lights that danced off the polished marble floors. Glass walls stretched far, creating an open, airy feel, as if the cars within were prized works of art placed on display for the world to admire. This wasn't just a dealership. It was a place where wealth met exclusivity, where millionaires and billionaires walked in and out with the confidence of those who knew they could afford whatever they desired. Malcolm's boots thudded heavily against the pristine floor as he walked through the automatic glass doors. His entrance was met with an almost immediate change in the atmosphere. The smell of fresh soil and country air clung to him, a stark contrast to the artificial scent of expensive cologne and polished leather that filled the showroom. His weathered flannel shirt, stained from the day's work under the hot sun, stood out against the sharp suits and crisp shirts of the other customers and employees. His jeans, worn and frayed at the knees, told a story of hard work and long hours, nothing like the tailored trousers that surrounded him. A few salesmen glanced over at him, exchanging looks as they whispered to each other, clearly unimpressed by his unkempt appearance. A couple browsing the high-end sports cars didn't even attempt to hide their judgment, their eyes scanning him from head to toe before they turned away with a sneer. It wasn't hard to see why. Malcolm didn't belong here. At least, not in their eyes. Brad Simmons, the showroom manager, had been standing near the front desk, chuckling to himself as he scrolled through his phone. But when he saw Malcolm walk in, his expression changed instantly. The joviality drained from his face, replaced with a look of disdain. His eyes traveled up and down Malcolm's figure as if assessing an intruder who had wandered into the wrong place. Malcolm wasn't fazed. He had seen that look countless times in his life, from people who didn't understand him, or worse, chose not to. He had been dismissed for his rough hands, for his calloused skin, for his humble origins, but he was here for a reason. Before he could even take another step, Brad moved in, blocking his path. The manager's posture was stiff, his face a forced mask of politeness, but it was clear he was already making assumptions. "Sir," Brad said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Can I help you with something?" Malcolm, unfazed, took a moment to look around the showroom, taking in the sleek cars that filled the room. "Yeah, I was hoping to take a look at the new limited edition model. I heard you had one in stock," he said evenly. Brad let out a short, almost mocking laugh. His eyes scanned Malcolm from head to toe once again. "We don't exactly do test drives for just anyone," he said, his smirk widening. "This isn't the kind of place where you just browse." Malcolm raised an eyebrow but remained calm. "I'm not here to browse," he replied. "I came for a reason." Brad chuckled under his breath, the condescension clear in his voice. "Our clientele is selective," he emphasized, making sure to linger on the word, as if Malcolm's presence here was some kind of mistake. He folded his arms and gave a dismissive wave towards the exit. "You might have better luck at one of the dealerships across town. They'd got a solid selection of used trucks." Malcolm's brow furrowed slightly, but he held his tongue. He had heard it all before. He could feel the judgment seeping from every word, the unspoken assumptions, the unspoken belief that he wasn't worth the time or the effort. Just as he was about to speak, the door to the showroom swung open again. But this time, the atmosphere shifted. The cool air that rushed in was almost a relief after the thick tension hanging in the room. Brad didn't even bother turning to acknowledge the new arrival. His focus remained firmly on Malcolm, as though keeping an eye on him was the only thing that mattered. Malcolm adjusted his cap, watching the new person enter. He didn't know why, but he could feel something was different. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was enough to make him pause. The man who walked in next was the complete opposite of Malcolm. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, the crisp white shirt underneath gleaming against the showroom lights. A sleek designer watch gleamed from his wrist, catching the light just right. He moved with the kind of confidence that only the wealthy truly knew, the kind of confidence that made people step aside, without a word spoken. Brad's eyes flicked towards him, and for the first time since Malcolm had entered, a sense of unease crept into his features. The man was young, perhaps in his early 30s, but he exuded a kind of authority that made the room shift. The salespeople, who had been previously whispering among themselves, went quiet. The couple near the electric blue sports car looked up, their eyes widening slightly at the newcomer. The man's gaze flicked from Brad to Malcolm, a look of recognition passing between them. A smile tugged at the corner of his lips, but it was subtle, controlled. As he walked towards Malcolm, his confident stride seemed to part the air around him, and the weight of the tension in the room began to lift just slightly. "Jared," Malcolm said, nodding slightly in his direction. There was no warmth in his voice, but the connection was clear. Jared Carter, the son of Malcolm's longtime friend, had stepped into the room with all the grace and poise that Malcolm lacked. "You're late," Malcolm commented, his tone steady, though the hint of a smile was barely perceptible. Jared chuckled, a deep sound that carried through the quiet showroom. "Yeah, got caught up with some last-minute calls," he said, clapping Malcolm on the shoulder like they had known each other for years. His gaze shifted, narrowing slightly as it settled on Brad, the showroom manager. Brad's face paled, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between Jared and Malcolm, and it was as if he couldn't quite reconcile what was happening. He had assumed, so confidently, that the man standing in front of him, Malcolm, was nothing more than a poor farmer. But Jared was another story entirely. Jared's eyes met Brad's with a coldness that made the air in the showroom thicken. "I see you already met my dad," he said, his voice casual but laced with something far sharper beneath the surface. There was no mistaking the edge in his tone. Brad stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. The shift was palpable. What had been an air of superiority and smugness now twisted into something far more desperate, like a man realizing he had made the gravest mistake of his life. Malcolm crossed his arms, watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. He had seen this kind of behavior before, had dealt with it on numerous occasions. The world had a way of humbling people like Brad, those who judged others by their appearance, and never once stopped to wonder what lay beneath the surface. The showroom, once filled with the hum of business as usual, was now filled with a tense silence, broken only by the occasional whispered comment from the few customers who were still brave enough to speak. And just like that, everything was about to change. The revelation. The showroom felt smaller now. Every inch of space seemed suddenly charged with an electric current, the kind that hums in the air before a storm breaks loose. Brad stood rooted to the spot, his mind scrambling to make sense of the turn of events, but his tongue was tied in knots. He had miscalculated. He had made a snap judgment about Malcolm, based on his appearance, based on the dirt-streaked boots and the weathered hands. He had assumed that a man like Malcolm would never belong in a place like this, a high-end luxury showroom filled with people who dressed well, spoke in hushed tones, and carried the subtle airs of money and status. But now, with Jared's presence in the room, Brad's entire world was shifting beneath him. Malcolm wasn't just some farmer. He was Jared's father. And Jared, the polished businessman in the expensive suit, had just made it very clear that the old assumptions Brad had held were not only wrong, but costly. Jared's sharp gaze never left Brad as he took a few slow steps forward, his polished shoes making no sound on the marble floor. The tension in the showroom thickened, and the energy in the room seemed to hang in the air, waiting for something to break the silence. It felt like everyone in the showroom was holding their breath, unwilling to make a move, as if they too could feel the weight of the moment. Brad finally found his voice, but it was shaky. I didn't realize," he said, his words coming out in a stutter. Jared didn't even flinch. "Didn't realize what?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, but there was something about it that made Brad's spine stiffen. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something far colder. "I didn't know he was." Brad trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He had no idea how to dig himself out of this hole. He had assumed so many things about Malcolm based on his appearance, and now the reality was staring him in the face. Jared's presence was a mirror to the arrogance that had come before, but Jared didn't seem interested in being a part of Brad's world. He seemed more than happy to leave it all behind. Jared's eyes hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Rich," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "That's what you were going to say, right? That you didn't know my father was rich." His words were slow and deliberate, as if he was trying to make Brad feel every ounce of discomfort that came with the realization of his mistake. Brad opened his mouth, but no words came out. There was no excuse, no justification for what had happened. He had assumed, based on Malcolm's clothes and his unpolished appearance, that he didn't have the money or the status to walk into a showroom like this. It was a judgment based entirely on the way someone looked. And now that judgment was biting him back harder than he had ever imagined. Jared's eyes flicked to Malcolm, his expression softening slightly, though the tension in the room didn't waver. "I see you already met my dad," he said again, his voice more controlled now, but there was a dangerous edge to it that made Brad's stomach twist. Malcolm, silent until now, shifted slightly. He met Brad's gaze without a flicker of emotion, his eyes calm but piercing. He had seen this kind of thing before, people dismissing him because of his clothes, his background, his appearance. It wasn't the first time, and he was certain it wouldn't be the last. But this time, it was different. This time, there was something satisfying in seeing Brad's carefully constructed world come crashing down. Brad's gaze snapped from Jared back to Malcolm, then back to Jared again. The realization of his mistake was dawning on him, but it wasn't just about being wrong about Malcolm's wealth. It was about the complete loss of control he was feeling. He was used to being the one in charge. He was used to having the power to dictate who belonged and who didn't. But now, with Jared standing in front of him, that power had slipped away, and it was slipping away fast. Jared took another step forward, his confidence unwavering, as if he had all the time in the world to watch Brad squirm. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice cool and measured, though the weight of his words made every syllable feel like a punch. "You saw a black man walk in here wearing work clothes, and instead of treating him like a paying customer, you decided he didn't belong. Is that right?" Brad's face turned red, his eyes darting around the showroom as if looking for an escape. But there was no way out. Not this time. Jared had him trapped with nothing but his own arrogance and stupidity. I didn't mean it like that," Brad stammered, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded hollow. He had been caught in the act, and there was no amount of smooth talking that could undo the damage. His carefully crafted image was unraveling, thread by thread, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jared tilted his head, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "No, I think you meant exactly what you said," he replied, his tone laced with ice. "And let me tell you something, Brad. People like you, people who think they can judge someone based on their clothes, or their skin color, or the way they walk into a room. You're the problem. You're the reason places like this, places that should be about respect, are built on arrogance instead." The showroom was now completely silent. The few customers who had been browsing, the salespeople who had been pretending to work, they were all watching. Some were even trying to hide behind their phones, pretending to scroll through text messages or emails, but everyone knew what was happening. Everyone knew the spectacle unfolding before them. Jared's voice dropped a few octaves, his words deliberate and sharp. "You treat money with respect, but you don't treat people with the same decency. You size them up based on their appearance, on the way they dress, and the color of their skin. And you think that gives you the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a weight. Brad's mouth opened, but the words were stuck in his throat. He had no defense, no excuse. He had spent so long playing the role of the elitist manager. discriminating against people who didn't fit his idea of who should be allowed to walk through the door, that he hadn't realized just how far he had gone. He hadn't realized how much he had alienated his own potential customers. And now, in the blink of an eye, it was all coming back to bite him. Jared took one last look at him before turning to Malcolm. "Did he even let you see the car?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Malcolm shook his head. "Didn't get that far," he said calmly, his expression unbothered. Jared's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, but it was cold. "Well, that's going to be a problem, Brad," he said, his eyes never leaving the showroom manager's face. "I was planning on buying 3 cars today. All cash." He let the words sink in, watching as Brad's face drained of color. The showroom, once a place where Brad was used to controlling the conversation, now felt like a trap closing in on him. A soft gasp came from the background, followed by the uneasy shuffling of a few customers. Brad's knees went weak, and for a moment, he wondered if he might actually faint from the realization of what was happening. Jared Carter was one of the most well-known buyers in the area, someone whose wealth and influence were undeniable. And now, that very same man was about to walk out of the door, leaving Brad with nothing but the wreckage of his own arrogance. Jared adjusted his cuff and glanced around at the others in the showroom. "You know what," he said, his voice casual but heavy with meaning. "I think I'll take my business somewhere else." The word hung in the air for a split second, and then Jared turned on his heel, making his way towards the exit with Malcolm right behind him. It was like a scene from a movie. Brad standing frozen in place, his world unraveling, while the 2 men walked out, leaving him behind in the wreckage of his own mistakes. Brad opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hand reached for his phone, but his fingers trembled as he fumbled to unlock it. He had to fix this. He had to make it right. But in his gut, he knew he couldn't. The damage had been done. And just like that, the 2 men who had walked into his showroom, dismissed as unworthy, were now leaving with the power to change everything. The fall. The heavy glass door swung shut behind Malcolm and Jared, leaving Brad standing in the middle of the showroom, paralyzed by the moment. The faint echo of the door's closing seemed to ring through the showroom like a death knell. The silence that followed was oppressive, too thick, too heavy, like a weight pressing down on Brad's chest. His heart raced in his chest, but his body was locked in place, unable to move, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Around him, the showroom seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes trained on him, though no one dared to speak. The salespeople who had been lingering on the edges of the showroom, waiting for a chance to pounce on a potential customer, now stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Some fidgeted uncomfortably, glancing between Brad and the door through which Malcolm and Jared had just exited. A few customers who had been browsing the vehicles murmured quietly among themselves, shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. Brad's mouth opened, then closed again, a futile attempt to gather his thoughts. His brain was spinning, trying to piece together the chaos of what had just unfolded. He had seen the man, Malcolm, walk in, and without a second thought, he had dismissed him. He had judged him based on the clothes he wore, the dirt on his boots, and the assumption that a man who looked like Malcolm couldn't possibly afford one of the cars in his showroom. And now, in the blink of an eye, that very same man had left with his son, the one person who could have bought not 1, but 3 cars, all cash. 3 cars with commissions that could have made Brad's entire year. The weight of his mistakes settled in, crushing him from the inside out. His carefully cultivated image as the showroom manager, the one who knew how to handle the rich and famous, who could read a potential client in an instant, had just shattered, like glass on a cold, hard floor. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about his pride, his sense of self, his position in the hierarchy of this place. And in one fell swoop, it was all gone. Brad looked around the showroom, but no one was looking at him with respect anymore. The employees had already begun to turn their attention elsewhere, pretending to focus on the cars or their phones, anything to avoid the uncomfortable silence that hung over the room. Even the receptionist, who had been cheerfully typing away just moments before, now had her eyes glued to her screen, her fingers tapping aimlessly as if she were afraid to make eye contact. "Brad," came a voice from behind him, cutting through the silence like a knife. It was the younger salesman who had been watching the entire scene unfold. The young man had been nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot during the exchange between Brad and Jared, clearly uncomfortable but not willing to speak up. Now his voice was hesitant, barely above a whisper. Brad turned slowly, his face still frozen in a mixture of disbelief and shame. "What?" he asked, his voice flat, his tone lacking the confidence it had once carried. The young salesman shifted uncomfortably. You really messed that up, didn't you?" Brad's jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't think I know that?" he snapped, his voice sharp, the anger barely contained beneath the surface. But the young salesman didn't back down. "No, I mean, you've been treating people like that for a while now, haven't you?" he said, his words bold now, as if he had found the courage to speak the truth. Brad swallowed hard, but he didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was right in front of him, staring him in the face, and it was too much to bear. He had spent so long in this world of luxury cars, wealthy clients, and polished appearances that he had forgotten the value of treating people with basic respect. He had gotten comfortable in his own bubble, assuming that everyone who didn't fit his ideal of a customer didn't deserve his time. But now, the reality was staring him down, and there was no escaping it. "I've been here a long time," the young salesman continued, his voice quieter now. "I've seen you treat people like that before, dismissing them because they didn't fit the image. But that guy's someone who could have bought a dozen cars without blinking. And you," he shook his head, "you just pushed him out the door." Brad opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was drowning in his own failure. The weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating him. Just then, the showroom's regional manager, Mr. Langford, walked in. His presence was like a sudden gust of wind, strong and undeniable, sweeping into the room and filling the air with an unspoken authority. Langford had been watching the entire exchange from the back office, no doubt hearing the murmurs and whispers of the employees. He didn't look at Brad right away. Instead, he glanced around at the room, as if assessing the situation. The moment he made eye contact with Brad, the showroom manager's stomach dropped. Langford's gaze was cold, calculating. There was no sympathy in his eyes, no understanding, just a quiet fury that spoke volumes. "Brad," Langford said, his voice low and even. "My office. Now." Brad's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment was coming. It was inevitable. But even still, the sense of dread that filled him was suffocating. His palms went clammy, and he could feel the sweat beginning to form at the back of his neck. The showroom, once a place where he had felt confident and in control, now felt like a cage. He didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. He simply nodded, too ashamed to speak, as Langford turned on his heel and walked toward the back office. Brad stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, as if hoping somehow someone would step in and fix the mess he had made. But no one moved. No one said anything. They had all seen what had happened. They had all seen the look in Jared's eyes, the calm confidence, the way he had dismantled Brad without raising his voice. The employees knew what that meant. Brad's days here were numbered. Reluctantly, Brad turned and walked toward Langford's office, each step heavy with the weight of his failure. The sounds of the showroom, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the soft clicks of heels on marble, seemed to fade as he walked down the hall. He had been the one to control this space, to manage it, to ensure that things ran smoothly. And now he was about to lose it all. Inside Langford's office, the door shut behind him with a soft thud, and the air seemed to grow colder. Langford sat behind a sleek, modern desk, his fingers steepled in front of him as he looked up at Brad. There was no warm welcome, no pleasantries, just the cold, hard reality that Brad had failed, and now he was facing the consequences. "Sit down," Langford said, his voice clipped. Brad hesitated for a moment, but then sank into the chair across from Langford. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. Langford didn't say anything right away. He simply stared at Brad, as if waiting for him to speak. But Brad couldn't find the words. How could he explain what had happened? How could he justify his actions? He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to judge people, to separate the worthy from the unworthy. But in that one moment, he had been exposed. The world had shifted beneath him, and he had no idea how to reclaim his place. Langford finally broke the silence. "You understand why you're here, don't you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Brad nodded, his throat dry. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A big mistake." Langford leaned forward, his gaze hardening. "This isn't about a mistake, Brad," he said. "This is about a pattern of behavior that we can no longer tolerate in this showroom. Do you understand that?" Brad swallowed, nodding again. He had been acting this way for years, making snap judgments about people, dismissing them based on their appearance or their financial status. But now, in the wake of what had just happened, he realized just how much it had cost him, and how much it had cost the dealership. He had lost a potential sale. He had lost the respect of his colleagues. And worst of all, he had lost something that money couldn't buy: his dignity. "Brad," Langford continued, his voice colder now, "I've spoken with the owner. We can't have someone like you representing this brand. You're done here." Brad's stomach sank. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His job, his career, his identity. It was all slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. "Pack your things," Langford said, his tone final. "You're done here." Brad stood up, his legs trembling beneath him. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? What could he possibly say to salvage anything from this? Without another word, he turned and walked out of Langford's office, the weight of his failure pressing down on him with every step. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but it might as well have been the sound of the door closing on his entire career. He was no longer the manager. He was just another man who had been humbled by his own arrogance. As he walked through the showroom one last time, the eyes of the employees followed him, some with pity, others with contempt. But none of them spoke, none of them needed to. They all knew what had happened. Brad stepped out into the parking lot, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. The weight of his actions was heavy, and as he walked to his car, he realized that the lesson had been learned, not through words, but through the harshness of experience. And that lesson was simple: never judge a book by its cover. The consequence. The sun was beginning its descent as Brad drove through the city, the light casting long shadows on the streets. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his knuckles white with the strain. He hadn't expected things to unfold this way, not so quickly, not so publicly. He had known there were risks to his behavior, of course, but he had never thought they would catch up to him so fast, or that they would cost him everything. He had just lost his job. And for what? A mistake born of arrogance, born of assumptions he had made based on someone's appearance. It had been so easy to dismiss Malcolm that day, to look at him and make a decision based on the dirt on his boots, the frayed edges of his clothes. So easy to assume he didn't belong, that he couldn't possibly be in a position to buy one of the high-end cars on display. Now, as Brad drove away from the dealership, he realized how far his judgment had gone wrong. Not just in terms of the sale he had lost, though that in itself was a blow to his ego, but in terms of everything else he had overlooked. His bias, his belief that wealth and status were the only things that defined people's worth, had blinded him to the fact that real value didn't lie in appearances. It wasn't just about the money someone had or the way they looked. It was about character, about respect, and about the stories that lay beneath the surface of the people he had brushed off over the years. He reached an intersection and stopped, his car idling at the red light. He glanced out the window, his reflection staring back at him. He could see the cracks in his own image, the guilt written across his face. He had been so focused on his status, on maintaining a polished persona that fit into this world of luxury cars and high-end clients, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly see people. He had forgotten how to treat others with respect, regardless of what they wore, where they came from, or how much money they had. The light turned green, and Brad pushed the gas pedal, the engine revving as he continued driving. His mind raced. What would he do now? What came next? He had no idea. He had been so certain of his place in the world, so confident that his position at the dealership was secure. But now, as he drove further away from the showroom, he realized how fragile his world had been. When he got home, he parked his car in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the front door of his house. The silence felt suffocating, the weight of his failure still hanging in the air. He had built his entire life around the idea that success and status were everything. But now, with the loss of his job and the realization of what had truly mattered, he felt an emptiness creeping in. He knew he had to face his mistakes, but the thought of going back to the dealership or even trying to explain himself to anyone else felt overwhelming. How could he justify his actions to anyone? How could he look them in the eye after everything that had happened? His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen, seeing the name of his friend, Jeff, flash on the display. With a sigh, he reached over and answered the call. "Hey, Brad, you okay?" Jeff's voice came through, warm and familiar. Brad leaned back in the seat, his eyes closing as he tried to process everything that had happened. "Not really," he muttered. I messed up, Jeff. I messed up big time." "What do you mean?" Jeff asked, sounding confused. Brad took a deep breath. He didn't know how to explain it, how to tell his friend what had gone down. But in that moment, he realized that he needed to talk about it. He needed to say it out loud, even if it made him feel weak. "I lost my job today," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "And it's my fault. I judged someone, and I didn't give them a chance. I thought I knew who they were based on their appearance, and I was wrong." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Brad could almost hear Jeff processing what he had just said. "Wait, you're telling me you lost your job over this?" Jeff asked incredulously. "Over a customer?" Brad nodded, even though Jeff couldn't see him. "Yeah," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought the guy was just some farmer, dressed like he didn't belong. But it turns out, he's the father of a major client, and I turned him away. The son had money, more than I could even imagine. But I couldn't see that. All I saw was the dirt on his boots, and I made a fool of myself." "Brad, man," Jeff started, but Brad cut him off. "I know," he said, frustration seeping into his voice. "I know I messed up. And now I don't know what to do. I've spent my whole career thinking that success was about status, about looking the part. But now I realize I was wrong, and it's cost me everything. I don't even know who I am anymore." There was another long pause, and then Jeff's voice broke through again, softer this time. "Brad, I think you just learned one of the hardest lessons there is," he said. "But it's not the end of the world. It's a setback, yeah, but it doesn't define you." Brad shook his head, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I don't know, Jeff. I feel like I'd lost more than just my job. I've lost respect. I'd lost myself. I don't know how to come back from this." Jeff didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice was firm. "You can come back from this, Brad. It's not going to be easy, but you can. The fact that you're even admitting what happened is a start. You're not blind to what you did. You're seeing it for what it was, and that's the first step to fixing it. Brad exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and frustration flooding his chest. I don't know how to fix it, Jeff. I don't know where to go from here. Start small, Jeff advised. Maybe you need to take some time to really think about what matters to you. Reevaluate your values. You don't have to have all the answers right away, but you do need to understand that the kind of success you've been chasing, based on status, wealth, and appearance, that's not the kind of success that will bring you peace. It's a trap. Brad stared out the windshield, the night creeping in around him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next sale or the next high-profile client. Instead, he was thinking about the person he had become, the things he had sacrificed in pursuit of an image. It was as if the world had stripped away all the distractions and forced him to see the truth of who he was. I'll think about it, Brad said quietly, his voice heavy with contemplation. Thanks, Jeff. I needed to hear that. Anytime, man, Jeff said. Just don't give up on yourself. We all make mistakes. What matters is how you learn from them. Brad ended the call and sat in the car for a few moments longer, the weight of his failure still pressing down on him. But now, amidst the guilt and shame, he felt a flicker of something else. Hope. Maybe he could rebuild. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. A chance to find out who he truly was, beyond the image he had so carefully crafted. With a deep breath, Brad opened the car door and stepped out. The night was still, but it felt different now. There was a long road ahead of him, full of challenges and uncertainties, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to face it. The awakening. The week that followed felt like a blur. The weight of his decision to walk away from the luxury dealership still loomed over Brad like a shadow, but the further he distanced himself from the showroom, the clearer things began to seem. The anger, the humiliation, and the guilt that had initially consumed him started to subside, slowly giving way to a kind of quiet reflection. For the first time in his life, Brad felt like he was truly seeing himself, not the polished image of the successful showroom manager he had built over the years, but the man who had made a mistake, a very public one, and was now left to pick up the pieces of his broken pride. It wasn't easy. The mornings were the hardest. Brad had always been the kind of man who got up at dawn, got dressed in his suit, and raced out the door to meet the demands of the day. But now, there was no showroom to rush to, no glossy cars or high-profile clients to impress. His routine had been shattered, and with it, his sense of purpose. There were moments when he found himself staring at the walls of his house, unsure of what to do next. It was as if a part of him had died along with his job, and he didn't know how to move forward. But little by little, things started to shift. At night, after he'd walked the streets near his home to clear his head, Brad found himself thinking more and more about what had happened, about the way he had judged Malcolm, about how easy it had been for him to dismiss someone based on their appearance. He had believed in the myth that success and status were the ultimate measures of a person's worth, and that myth had blinded him to the reality that true value came from something far deeper. He started to read again, something he hadn't done in years. Books that challenged his perspective, that made him think about his past actions. He pored through articles and essays about human behavior, about judgment and prejudice, and how people like him had been conditioned to view the world through a lens of class and wealth. The more he read, the more he understood how deeply ingrained these biases were within him, and the more he realized that his behavior hadn't just been a one-time lapse in judgment, it had been a pattern. He had treated countless people this way over the years, judging them based on superficial traits like their clothes, their accent, or the way they carried themselves. And now he had to face the truth. He had been wrong. All this time, he had been blind to the essence of who people really were. But this wasn't just about him feeling bad for himself. No, the guilt he felt was a starting point, but it was only the beginning. He needed to do more than just feel bad. He needed to make amends, to prove to himself that he could change. The thought of going back to the dealership, even after everything that had happened, crossed his mind. He wasn't sure what it would accomplish, but there was a part of him that wanted to face the people he had let down, to explain that he wasn't the same person who had turned Malcolm away. But then he remembered something. The world had a way of revealing the truth, and there were more important battles to fight than the one he had been waging against his own ego. One afternoon, as Brad was sitting in a small coffee shop, staring out the window, his phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Jeff. "Hey man, I've been talking to some people. There's a guy I know who's looking for someone to help with his farm. He's a hard-working guy, but he's looking for someone with a good work ethic. I think you'd be a perfect fit. I know it's not what you were doing before, but it's a start. Let me know what you think." Brad stared at the message for a long moment, unsure how to respond. A farm. It wasn't the kind of job he had ever imagined himself taking, not after years of managing luxury cars and living a life built around status. But something in Jeff's message sparked something inside him. A start. That was exactly what he needed. A fresh start. And if this was a chance to rebuild, to prove to himself that he could do something different, something grounded, then maybe this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He texted back a simple response. "I'm in. When do I start?" The reply came almost immediately. "Tomorrow morning. Meet me at the farm at 7 a.m. I'll introduce you to him." The next morning, Brad woke up earlier than usual, a mix of nerves and anticipation flooding his body. He pulled on a pair of worn jeans, an old t-shirt and boots, nothing like the expensive suits and shoes he had once worn to work. This time, there was no need for a polished appearance. This time, he was just another man, starting a new chapter. He drove to the farm, the road unfamiliar and winding, far away from the polished streets he had once traveled so confidently. When he arrived, the farm stretched out before him. Endless fields of green, a stark contrast to the gleaming showroom floors he had once known. Jeff was already there, waiting by a rusty pickup truck, his hands resting casually on the steering wheel. "You made it," he said with a grin as Brad approached. Brad nodded, his eyes taking in the vastness of the land. It felt different, almost humbling. There was no grandeur here, no fancy cars or spotless surfaces, just hard work, nature, and the promise of something simpler. "Come on," Jeff said, waving him toward the fields. "I'll introduce you to Greg." Greg was a middle-aged man with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands. He had the look of someone who had spent his life working the land, and his eyes held a quiet intelligence that made Brad feel like he had much to learn. They exchanged pleasantries, but Greg wasted no time in getting down to business. "I need someone who's not afraid to get their hands dirty," Greg said, his voice deep and steady. "If you're here to work, we'll start right away. But if you're just looking for a paycheck without putting in the hours, then this isn't for you." Brad nodded, understanding immediately that this wasn't going to be the easy life he had once led. No luxury cars, no clients in suits. This was about labor, about sweat, about doing something that required dedication and grit. There was no place for ego here, just a man, working alongside other men, building something that had real value. As the day wore on, Brad found himself using muscles he hadn't used in years. He spent the morning helping Greg move equipment, clearing fields, and learning the ins and outs of farm life. It was exhausting, and by midday, his muscles ached in ways they never had before. But there was something strangely satisfying about the work. For the first time in a long time, Brad didn't feel the weight of judgment, his own or anyone else's. It was just him, the earth, and the people who had welcomed him into their world with open arms. When the workday came to a close, Greg clapped Brad on the back. "You did good today," he said. "You've got a solid work ethic. Not everyone can hack it, but I think you're gonna do fine here." Brad smiled, the first genuine smile he had smiled in weeks. He didn't know if this was where he would stay long-term, or if this was just a temporary detour on his path to something else. But what mattered was that he had found a new purpose. And more importantly, he had found a way to start over. To rebuild from the ground up. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was real. As Brad drove home that evening, his body sore and tired, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Contentment. For the first time in months, the noise in his head had quieted. There were no more worries about status or image. There was just the simplicity of the day's work, and the satisfaction that came with it. Brad had taken the first step on a long journey of self-discovery. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. The growth. The weeks that followed were a blur of early mornings and long, grueling days. Brad had learned quickly that farm life wasn't something you could approach half-heartedly. It demanded everything from a person: physical strength, mental focus, and a kind of humility that he hadn't realized he was missing. Each day, Brad found himself on his hands and knees in the dirt, clearing fields, mending fences, and feeding livestock. The work was backbreaking, and there were days when the exhaustion felt like it might swallow him whole. But there was something about it, something incredibly grounding, that kept him going. At first, Brad had been embarrassed. He had come from a world where image was everything, where his appearance, his reputation, his ability to talk circles around people in boardrooms had earned him respect. And here, in the mud and sweat of the farm, he felt stripped down to nothing. For the first few days, he found himself questioning his decision to leave the dealership. He had worked so hard to build the life he had, and now, here he was, doing manual labor that had once seemed beneath him. But with each passing day, something inside him began to change. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but it was noticeable. Brad started to understand what people like Greg, the farm owner, meant when they spoke about the importance of hard work and dedication. In the world Brad had come from, success was measured by the car you drove, the suit you wore, and the name of the people you associated with. But here, success was measured by the way you carried yourself, the honesty in your work, and the respect you earned through sweat and effort. At the end of the third week, as Brad was taking a break by the barn, his hands wrapped around a cold bottle of water, Greg approached him. Greg's weathered face broke into a smile, one that was rare but genuine. "You're doing good," Greg said, his gravelly voice giving the words more weight than they might have carried coming from someone else. "You've got the work ethic. Most guys would have quit by now." Brad looked at him, surprised by the compliment. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," he said, shaking his head. "But I don't know. It feels different. In a good way." Greg nodded, glancing out over the fields. "Life here isn't easy," he said, his voice low. "But it's real. And real can be tough to come by sometimes." Brad stood there for a moment, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues. There was a stillness in the air, a calmness that he hadn't known in his previous life. Sure, the work was difficult, and the days were long, but there was a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that his effort was what made everything work. There was no room for pretense here, just honesty. Over the next few weeks, Brad started to let go of the old patterns that had defined him. The need to prove himself, the obsession with the superficial markers of success, slowly faded away. Instead, he focused on what he could control, the quality of his work, the way he treated the people around him, and the relationship he was beginning to build with the land itself. It was slow progress, but it was progress nonetheless. One afternoon, as he and Greg were repairing a fence on the far side of the property, Brad's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another spam message or a notification he didn't care about. But when he looked at the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Jared Carter. "Hey Brad, it's Jared. I've been thinking about you and wanted to reach out. I heard about what happened at the dealership, and I wanted to say something. I know things went south that day, but I've been thinking about what you said, about people judging based on appearances. I want you to know that I don't hold any ill will. In fact, I respect you for owning up to it. It's rare. I think you're on the right path. I have a few projects I'm working on, and I could use someone who knows how to get things done. If you're interested, let's talk sometime. No pressure. Just wanted to check in." Brad stood there for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. The message stirred something inside him. He had expected Jared to be angry, to hold some kind of grudge. After all, Brad had publicly embarrassed himself, and by extension, Jared's family. But here was Jared, offering understanding, extending a hand when Brad had least expected it. And the offer? It was something Brad had never thought would come from someone like Jared, someone from the world he used to inhabit. A chance to work on a project, to make use of his skills in a way that didn't require pretending to be someone he wasn't. Brad could feel the tension in his chest slowly begin to ease. He hadn't expected this, but deep down, he knew that this message was a sign that things had changed, not just for him, but for his relationship with the world he had left behind. He texted back, "Thanks, Jared. I appreciate it. I'm interested. Let's talk soon." As soon as he hit send, a wave of relief washed over him. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the weight of his past failures hanging over him. He felt lighter, freer. The work at the farm had already taught him so much, about patience, about humility, and about what it really meant to succeed. But now, as he thought about Jared's message, he realized that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. The next few days were spent with a renewed sense of purpose. He poured himself into his work on the farm, knowing that the skills he was gaining now could transfer to whatever came next. He wasn't sure what that next chapter would look like, but he knew he was ready for it. When he met with Jared, they discussed several potential projects, ranging from development work in real estate to other ventures in business that required a unique blend of creativity and hands-on effort. It was clear that Jared had always respected Brad's drive, even if Brad hadn't seen it in himself. Now, with a fresh perspective on life, Brad was eager to see what he could contribute. Through it all, the most important lesson he had learned was this: success wasn't about status. It wasn't about how much money you had or what kind of car you drove. It wasn't even about how many people recognized your name or how you dressed. Real success came from the work you put into the world, the way you treated people, the value you brought, and the integrity you upheld. And Brad had spent too many years chasing the wrong kind of success. That day, as Brad walked back to his modest little cabin on the farm, he felt a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't about accolades or recognition. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about knowing, deep in his bones, that he had found something real, a purpose that had nothing to do with appearances or wealth. It was about the work, the effort, the humility, and the growth. Brad didn't know where the future would take him, but for the first time in a long time, he was confident that he was headed in the right direction.